Hello, buenas noches. Get a little higher if I can. Thank you. First of all, I'd love to thank all of you for coming tonight and being part of the Weil Art Exchange, which we started this year. I also want to thank our sponsor in New York City, the William H. Donner Foundation, for making this all possible. First, let me introduce Alex Gill. Come on stage. Buenas. Alex is a working architect and has a firm called Space Cutter in New York City. Alex went to the famous Cooper Union in New York City and then continued his studies at Harvard University. About a year ago, Alex showed me a design he made where he had all these different stairs using a single stairwell, and I was like, wow, this is incredible, this is very interesting. And I still don't understand how it works, but I was very impressed. Have you seen the stairs here at Studio Weil? Very interesting stairs we have here as well. Now let me introduce Daniel Libeskind. As you know, Daniel's architect, also an artist, and also a humanitarian. Again, thank you for coming. The two are going to have a discussion about art, architecture, and then we will have a question and answer period, and you're welcome to ask any questions. Thank you again very much for coming tonight.
Hello. I hope you can understand English. Probably yes. Great. Because translation is always a very difficult thing. So we have a great translator here, but I would prefer if our conversation would be more smooth. And then if you don't understand something, you can raise your hand later on. Okay.
Aquí tenemos un traductor en caso que hace falta.
Speak closer to that mic.
Okay. Aquí tenemos traductor en caso que haga falta en el medio o al final. I'm pleased to be here with you all. Pleased to be here with you, Daniel.
You have to please speak closer to the microphone because you can't be heard.
All right.
You have to project your voice.
Project. Okay. Sure. Okay. When I was admitted to the Cooper Union in 1990 to study architecture, that was prior to the internet, and it was very motivational for me to know that there was a project like the Jewish Museum in Berlin happening somewhere. I didn't have a grasp of where it was. Google was not so dominant then, but it was very motivational for me to know that it was happening somewhere. Just the force in the drawings, the representation. I always doubted, is it really happening somewhere? Because it was just that incredible. And I was telling Daniel that when I was there, said under a very important professor, Peter Eisman, and he always said that Daniel was his best student, even though that was probably 30 years prior. That was also very motivational. I want to know, Daniel, if you will tell us how it was working with Barbara on this project. I've looked at her paintings, her sculpture, and I see a lot of a symbiosis, movement, the shards. Just how was it on a creative level, but also maybe on the more pragmatic stuff?
Well, first of all, I was so lucky to meet Barbara. She had the best laughter anybody ever had. She would, laugh and have a sense of humor. And I really admire her work. She's a powerful artist. And I shared intuitively many things with her work when I saw her drawings, her paintings, her sculptures, very architectural in many ways. And so it was a very fortuitous meeting because we didn't argue. You know, sometimes, you know, I have other projects where, you know, people question why is this and how is this and what is this. This is a very unusual studio. It's not a conventional, you know, box with, you know, big skylight or something. But I really designed it with Barbara's intuition and with her sense of form, with her love for color, with her a strong sense of something new in the work. And also, by the way, I designed it with my own genius loci idea of Ramon Llull, because I always loved Ramon Llull, and I thought that it's not by coincidence that Barbara's work is in Mallorca. Ramon Llull, I love his, you know, his wheels of his mind, and I thought that's kind of a combination that is meaningful and can really be a seed for creating a very practical studio for Barbara. So that's how we met, and it was a wonderful collaboration.
You've mentioned that the design for Studio Weil came out of some of the Chamberworks drawings, which happened 10 years prior to the commission when you were head of Cranbrook. And you also mentioned that you mined part of the virtual house for some of the concepts that were in there. When you were making these drawings, which are line drawings with some movement, some focusing, some overlapping of shapes and of tensions, edges, dispersal, when you were making them, did you have an idea of how you might mine them later, or were they always something?
Well, I would have to explain to you if you don't know those drawings, and there's no reason you should. But I spent most of my life not building buildings. Most of my life I spent drawing. You know, my first building is the Jewish Museum, and I was, you know, not a young kid when I built and I never built even a small project. And I want to tell you, I never, even in school of architecture, never drew a building because I thought, and I had very talented teachers who allowed me to graduate, but I always thought that if you don't have a client, if you don't have a real social idea, if you don't have a place, a real place, a genius loci, it's not possible to draw a building. So I never sort of identify with the architects who did imaginary buildings. You know, in the 18th century, in the 17th century, you know, the ideal school, the ideal, you know, museum, the ideal house. It never appealed to me. But I was an architect, and I believed myself to be deeply an architect. So what did I do? I drew. Now, what could I draw if I rejected the idea of drawing buildings? I drew the structure of architecture which comes out of drawing. It's a very difficult thing to describe those drawings. They're called chamber works. They were made in a chamber, like the particles that we discover in the chamber of physics. And I related them to music because in my previous life I was a professional musician. So music and drawing are one single thing. And music is drawn out of notes, which are also drawn in the score. So what were the chamberwork drawings? There are 28 drawings. It's a kind of portfolio of drawings, 14 vertical drawings and 14 horizontal drawings. And they are systematically colliding and collapsing into a very, very narrow space. So they start very wide and they end up in very, very thin area where the drawing. They're drawn with a drawing pen in black ink on paper. And I cannot really describe them. You know, you'd have to, maybe on the internet you can see at least an approximation of what they look like. But in any case, all my work comes from those drawings. All my buildings.
Wow.
I've never designed a building which is not from those drawings. So it's my treatise of architecture. You know, Guarini did a treatise on architecture. You know, Piranesi did, you know, his Campo Marzio treatise on reconstructing Rome. You know, Borromini did a treatise on you know, how to make architecture. Durand made a treatise on architecture. Le Corbusier in the Modular made a treatise on architecture. That was my sort of my way to grasp, to create architecture out of nothing. Really, creating architecture out of nothing, because there was nothing there. There was no site, there was no plan, there was no project, there was no belief in any mythology of the future. And so that's the drawings that were my path. And by the way, sorry, I did say a little
this
bit.
is great.
I defined this building, and Barbara's work is kind of in the mystical category. It's not just abstract art, spilling paint. There's a mysticism in this work that looks very happy and very colorful, but it's mystical in many ways, the communication of that work. And I would say that drawing itself is a mystical discipline. If drawing itself, if you're not just drawing for a functional purpose to represent something. So those drawings are really, all drawings in architecture are a kind of a divine, I would say some sort of a divine tool, because out of the drawing comes everything which is built. Think about it. Everything which is built, this lamp, this one, everything that we wear, comes out of a drawing. The whole city comes off some lines that somebody drew. The biggest skyscrapers, the most complex cities, in China, the most minuscule things that we have come out of a drawing. Mm-hmm. And what is a drawing? That's really a question. What is a drawing? What is a line? What is a point? Now, Bauhaus, Kandinsky and Gropius said, the square, the circle, and the triangle are the basis of the world, which is true. It was a late interpretation of the mysticism. But in any case, that's where my work comes from, and so does this house, because, and let me just explain a little bit. I was in a competition which I won, run by the Center of Architecture in Canada, Montreal, Phyllis Lambert, who of course was the person who worked with Mies van der Rohe on the Seagram's building. She had a competition for the virtual house. And there were many famous architects invited to participate, to design a virtual house. And many of them designed virtual houses that could be virtually completed in real space. My idea was to take my chamberwork drawings, those drawings that I just described, to multiply them, to stretch them into a circle, to sort of make from these linear drawings, which are in blocks of paper, to create a gigantic panorama, a circle, and to compress them into each day of the year, to 365 days. So each drawing was on top of another drawing until there were 365 of them in a circle. And then that was my virtual house. So it was a kind of a cylinder with very complex relationship between each of the layers that represented a single day of the year. It's a kind of calendar I created. That's the virtual world. It's a calendar of anniversaries that can never be had. And in part, my idea of Ramon Llull came also from the cylindrical memory wheels which he constructed. I don't know whether you know them. But Ramon Llull constructed the first computer, really. He was really the mysticism. The nuns, in 13th century, invented the barbed wire. In the monasteries, they invented the parachute. They were not, so yeah, it makes sense that these inventions come out of those things. Anyway, that's how the house and the drawings come together.
These chamberworks drawings, they're line drawings. They're quite abstract. You can infer a lot into them. Looking at the Weil studio, I'm here for the first time. I would have said that maybe they were mined from the Micro Mega series, because I could there's that shallow spatial quality.
Well,
in there.
that's a very interesting comment. It's interesting. I made another series of drawings called Micro Megas before Chamberworks. Because I had to do something. I had no other job. I was not building any buildings.
You were dean of a school?
I was a dean of a school. I did many things of that sort, but not as a practicing architect, so to speak. But it's interesting. micromegas, which seem to be much more kind of abstract, more familiar abstract drawing, maybe more related to modernist, I could never manage to create a single building out of them. It's amazing. I tried many times, and you know the Getty collection in Getty in Los Angeles has collected all my drawings, all those drawings there. Museum of Modern Art has the Chamberworks drawings, but I never succeeded in making those drawings to anything. I could never make them into any space.
Yeah.
But the Chamberworks were drawings that I could really functionalize and easily create, you know, the master plan of Ground Zero out of them.
Right. Talking about drawings, I imagine that some of the audience, or a lot of the audience, is artists, or also architects. But in these earlier drawings, they have a technical nature, more abstract. You can see a lot into them. Let's say that they could be a house, they could be a city, a master plan, and then what I seem to infer is that for a specific project, I might see a freer kind of sketch, and so the very technical and then a freer sketch. When do you find one method, appropriate?
That's a great question. Of course, you have to make a sketch. You know, sketching is very important when you come to a site, a real site. You have to be inspired. You have to be able to draw. Of course, that's the tool. I don't do it in any other way. But at some point, as you say, it has to turn into a more technical, more precise, geometrical substance. So there's a relation between, of course, the sketch and the more formal drawings, just the way there would be a connection between an intuitive idea and something very, very clear that can be communicated to somebody else. So yeah, it's a matter of a logic of how to develop a building. Of course, it came out of a sketch, and later on came into Chamberworks, and then out of the chamber, it came into an architectural space.
Right, I got it. Architecture is a little bit of a funny profession because sometimes when you ask the architects, they each have their own unique definition of what architecture actually is. Being an architect, I would say my concise definition is that it is a device, the art of making a device that separates humans from nature. But I'm very curious what your definition of architecture is.
It's a great point actually that you're making. Nobody knows what architecture is because the word architecture is used universally. There's the architecture of DNA. There's the architecture of the stars. There's the architecture of the economic system. There's the architecture of biology. So the word architecture is a word that is universally used to name something which has integrity, which has structure, which has functionality, and which is in some way also a mechanism. But it is really just a word because the arche in the word architecture refers also to something ancient, to something like archaeology, like the word archaeology has the word arche, right? Something in it. So it's not so much about defining architecture, but seeing architecture. And look, you can see architecture everywhere. I don't think there's any place in the world, even in the black holes. And my son is an astrophysicist. He's a cosmographer. Representing what the black holes look like in space. His work just appeared in Nature magazine, if you're interested. His name is Noam Libeskind. He's discovered the largest rotating mass in the universe. So what is a black hole? It has an architecture. It's not just nothing. So even the most impalpable, ineffable things in our minds, in our experience, in our observation, are architectural in their nature. And it's not by coincidence that somebody like Blake drew God as an architect, right? God in that famous drawing of Blake is up high with a big compass, and he's constructing. Well, even in the Bible, right? God is creating. Now he's creating not with a compass, but by saying things, by speaking. He's creating things. So, yeah, architecture is that kind of a space.
Thank you. We're living in a more globalized world in the last decade or decade and a half, and there's this notion of destination architecture. Previously it was called the Bilbao effect. You've worked on many museums and galleries, and just curious about maybe there's a desire for there to be a spectacle of the exterior versus maybe sometimes maybe curators might want a more silent or more neutral interior. Just
Well,
your
you
thoughts on
might
that?
be right, but neutrality never interested me. I'm really not interested in anything which is neutral. I don't like neutral colors. I don't like neutrality in general in world politics. I don't like neutrality in life. The truth is that in the 18th century, it's nothing new. You know, if you were well off, if you had some means, if you were educated, you would go to the trip to see the icons of architecture. You know, even from Germany, Goethe would go with his horse and carriage, he was pretty well off, all the way, you know, to what he considered Africa, which is southern Italy. You know, so, you know, people went to see interesting buildings. In Polybius, you know, if you read Roman history, you know, they went to see, you know, even Herodotus, right? He went to Egypt to look at, you know, great buildings, the pyramids. So it's nothing new. It's not about star architecture. It's about interesting buildings that attract people's minds and hearts and are worthy of visiting. Now, not everything that is advertised is such a building. There are a lot of well-photographed buildings which are not really interesting when you go there. So, yeah, the public has more access now through the internet, through the new technology, to be able to reach obscure places and find out for themselves. And I think that's really great. People are able to find out what are good buildings, what are not good buildings, what are buildings which are just by advertisement, what are buildings that have been omitted from architectural history or from the encyclopedias of architecture because they didn't fit in at all to the prevailing ideology of what is important. So, yeah.
So when the curators, if they may come to a design meeting and they have input on the interior, you nod?
No, I have to say that every building I've made, you know, one of the most radical museums I've built is the Denver Art Museum. I don't know whether anybody knows here. It's a very radical building in every way, spatially. It doesn't have a single box gallery, though it has large spaces for temporary exhibitions to be shown. The curator of that museum told me that, and Denver is not, you know, New York, and it's not Chicago, and it's not Los Angeles. But Denver, in the Denver Art Museum, has more than 1 million visitors. You know, coming to a building that is very unorthodox, but incredibly flexible for the desires of creative curators and interesting exhibitions. They have exhibitions of very classical kind to the, you know, recent exhibitions of, you know, Christian Dior's, you know, fashion or something like that. So buildings I have worked on always very closely with curators. I've never designed a building by myself saying this will work. By the way, there is one architect who did that, Mies van der Rohe in Germany. You know, the National Gallery, which has just been opened after renovation of some years. It's very interesting. You know, the building is a glass building, and it has an underground. And Werner Haftmann, who was the director when the building opened in Berlin, said to Mies van der Rohe, and this is true, Mr. van der Rohe, it's a beautiful building, but what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to display the paintings in this building? And Mies van der Rohe famously replied, I'm the architect, I'm not the curator. It's your problem. Now, of course, Mies van der Rohe designed an underground completely without any light where all the paintings are. On the top, it's very difficult because of the light.
It's a void. Yeah.
It's a void. It's very difficult to display, you know, any paintings or anything like that. But anyway, it's a different attitude of mine because I worked closely with curators, and I never made a building that, you know, was not really agreed upon, or even asked for by the curators. When I designed the Denver Art Museum or the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, one thing the curators told me, Mr. Libeskind, don't give us a box. We don't want a box. We don't want another, white cube or black cube. Please don't give it to us. Otherwise, I would have given them a black cube or a white cube.
You've worked on many museum projects. Let's start off. Let's compare the Jewish Museum in Berlin, where we have this classical structure, and then your addition shows this incredible movement coming out of the side. And that was a project that had a challenging path to construction. Maybe it was almost canceled. Maybe it took 8 years, 10 years to be built, well, to break ground. And then later in your career, if we compare that to maybe the Dresden Military History Museum, where it was a problematic museum to open, but they gave you the confidence to intersect the structure. So from an appendage separate to intersection over here, do you find that the audiences are maybe more open to your work? Or?
Well, the world is changing, definitely. It doesn't change very quickly in architecture. It changes quickly in science, in medical science. Look, in 1 year, the vaccine was invented. I mean, it usually takes 15 years for a vaccine to come to the market. But because of modern science, modern technology, we had a vaccine in a very quick way. Architecture changes very slowly. If you think about it, architecture hasn't changed that much in 5,000 years, 7,000 years. It's, if we think of what we think about, space flight, how our bodies are organized, the elimination of diseases, the comfort of everyday life. If you think of architecture, it's pretty much as it was, in Knossos in 7th century BC. Still a room, a bed, a window, a door. It's kind of unbelievable, isn't it? Because even the great site, I'm designing now the Albert Einstein archives in Jerusalem. Albert Einstein was one of the founders of the Hebrew University back when it was still Palestine in 1920. And I'm designing the building that will have his, theory of relativity, his whole works. He donated it to the university. But if you think, how did Albert Einstein sleep? Now, what did his bedroom look like? Well, he had a good architect, Mendelssohn, he had good architects, modernists, but the buildings are pretty conservative. Albert Einstein, with his amazing idea of the speed of light, traveling at the speed of light, slept in a bed pretty much like yours. It was like near a wall. It had a bed cover, it had a pillow. There was a window with a curtain, a rug. So my question is, why have human beings been so slow to adapt to architecture? I sometimes introduce a new angle, and it's a scandal. It's a scandal because the window isn't orthogonal. It moves in some direction. And people think this is crazy. Libeskind is kind of crazy because he's doing something illegal. But this brings me to another point. Barbara Weil is a great artist. She stood in her studio, and I watched her. She could do what she wanted. She wanted yellow, she took yellow paint. She wanted to carve the figure this way, she did it this way. There was no authority to make her work illegal. Now, in architecture, such an authority exists. It's really incredible that architecture is called an art, but it is highly controlled by law, by politics, by ideology. Jacques Derrida, Jacques Derrida, the great French philosopher, I was once talking to him and he said, Mr. Libeskind, for me it's very easy because I can publish anything I want on the internet. I don't need a publisher to approve of my thoughts. I write something, I think of something, and I put it on the internet. And there it is. But you, Mr. Libeskind, you need to have a legal permission to do even a small house like this one. You know, it has to have a legal permission. How do you do that? Why do you do that? Well, I've often wondered, when will the policing of architecture cease? Now, Gaudi, right? Spain, we're in Spain. Mallorca is part of Spain. There is Gaudi. He's doing something which would be illegal almost anywhere, but because he's a Catholic, he has the support of some powerful people, he's able to do something that kind of blends into Art Nouveau, but is uniquely a work of a genius, of an independent spirit. So this is my question. When will architecture shed its militarism? And I call it militarism because think about it, the grid, you know, the grid, where does it come from? The grid of the city. It comes from military architecture, from the Romans. Put the grid, that's how you organize soldiers. That's how the grid cities have developed. I live in New York. It's a grid city, but it's a Roman city. It's a Roman military city. Luckily different, because we have a lot of illegal things in New York. But in any case, that's what I want you just to think about. How controlled our notion of space really is. And why is it so controlled? What are we afraid of? Why are people fearful that architecture will do something illegal and then the city will collapse as a result? No, because an artist can do it. You know, a composer can compose any piece of music. You know, atonal music, noise music. You know, music structured in a totally different way. You can bring in influence from Africa. You can have African music. You can have world music, right? You can have music, but it has always fascinated me why architecture. And I don't believe it will stay that way. I think that democracy will succeed, despite what we see in the world. There's no doubt in my mind. And finally, the militaristic control of architecture will collapse, and architecture will change overnight. We will not recognize what cities look like. Suddenly, they'll change in such a radical way that no one has predicted it, not even Asimov or any science fiction writer.
When did that happen?
You know, it's hard to tell. It can happen overnight. We don't. It's hard to predict. You know, the spirit moves where it wills, as the New Testament says. You know, there's no way to control the spirit, but it happens suddenly. You know, if you're a believer, and I'm definitely a believer.
I wanted to ask about the evolution of your language in architecture. That there are certain repeating themes, the void, the movement, multiplicity, underground, the possibility of being lost. Let's say that those are internal interests, and it's very difficult to build, and there's many pragmatic interests that we run across. I wanted to know, how would you say that your view has changed on those over time, over your career?
Well, I've maintained from the very beginning that never start thinking about what is possible. Never start with, you know, what can be built, you know, think of, you know, draw whatever you want and then discover if it's possible to build it. But don't start with the possibilities that you already know about. By the way, that's not my idea. That's the idea of the Bauhaus. Don't start with what is possible. Start with your idea. And then discover if the idea can meet reality. I don't think in that sense maybe the only disadvantage I have now, as I often think, is that I have more experience, which is really a disadvantage. I think the less experience you have, the more you're connected to architecture, to be an architect. You know, when you know almost nothing, you have an advantage over somebody who knows a lot. I know that's not taught in schools. People in schools usually, and I used to teach, you know, part of my life I was an academic, so to speak, a professor in famous schools. But I always encourage my students to forget what they've been taught. Because, you know, at some point you have to think on your own. What do you really believe in? What is really true? Don't just believe, the things that have been said or the propaganda, and every era has its propaganda. I'm very happy I was not an architect in the 50s. Because if I was in the 50s, there was like a reconstruction of after the war, right? All the buildings kind of had the same idea, kind of quickly reconstruct something. That would have been a bad time to be born for me. But luckily, this era, this generation was sort of, possibilities. The Woodstock generation, I guess I'm not the Woodstock generation, probably older, but I went to school still in 1968. So, yeah, it's I don't know, maybe now there's more conformity, people believe more in a more narrow definition of things, but I encourage everybody, because I think everybody has talent. Everybody in any walk of life has a lot of artistic talent. I think most people are artists, but they don't even know about it. They could create amazing things in any field that they are interested in. And it's never too late to start,
I wanted to ask you, in your work, something that you mentioned is that it occurs an absence or a void, a place that we go to where we would have a sensation. And earlier on in your intro, you were saying that even your son is studying black holes and the void and the nothingness and the awe of it. And it's a primordial concept, the void, the black hole. But I want to know.
Well, look, we were all born out of a drop of liquid. I mean, think about it. Who are we to think that we can dominate the world? Where do we come from? How is birth? What is, as Stephen Hawking said, great scientist. My son actually studied with him.
Amazing, yeah.
My son studied with Stephen Hawking at Cambridge. Stephen Hawking said the universe comes out of nothing. He doesn't say that it comes out of nothing. It's kind of strange because it's like a theological thought. Creation ex nihilo. It's pretty amazing. That's modern science. It's not the church or the synagogue or the mosque. It's the modern science who tells us. So when you say the word void, or when you say the concept of darkness or underground or the unknown, I think it's very close to us. We often don't deal with it, but we are bound to encounter it sooner or later. We are bound to encounter it. Arthur Rubinstein, do you know that famous pianist? I always remember his fantastic interview on CBS, and he was already an elderly man, much older than I am now, and and the interviewer was Dan Rather said, "Mr. Rubinstein, you're 85 years old, whatever you are. What are you thinking of now?" And Rubinstein said, "I'm thinking of my death, and it's very exciting,
Wow.
because I have no idea how I'm going to die. I don't know whether I would just collapse suddenly, whether I'll be run over by a car, whether I'll get deadly sick and linger in a bed. I'm just so excited." Okay, there is a very good definition of what surrounds us.
Transitioning from the void, which is a dominant technique or thought, to the Renaissance idea of the picturesque, and that they might look a certain way from a certain angle. Maybe it's something that I rejected early on in my career because it didn't have the rigor of an internal organization. But I just wanted to know, does it operate in your work, the picturesque?
Well, I always think that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So a picture is very important. The picture, that just, whatever you can see, an emblem, a symbol, a sudden insight into something that you can see. Now maybe it's emojis, or it's something on the internet, or it's a visual clue that you get on your tablet. But it is about seeing something. So seeing is definitely, I think, key to grasping something. And I think it's important to say that architecture is not a very obvious art, because I always think about it when I'm in this house of Barbara Weil. I mean, her spirit is here. And I think of when she finishes a painting, it's finished. She's not adding anything to it. It's there. It's completed, and it can be put on the wall. When her son is a jazz musician, Jimmy, when he plays a jazz composition, it's finished. It's actually produced and composed, and it is an entity. Or when someone writes a poem, it's finished. It's not to be manipulated. But when a piece of architecture is finished, think about it. What is it? It's basically some sort of a emblem or a symbol that has to be filled by somebody else's spiritual experience. In other words, it's more like the brain colliding with the skull, right? The gray matter of the brain that is held by the rigidity of the skull. So the skull is kind of holding the brain, but without the brain, there is no thought and no experience. So architecture needs a spiritual experience to make it come alive. It's not finished when it's finished. It's only when people can have that spirit that a building means something. Otherwise, it's just a ruin, or it's a nothing. It's very interesting to think about it. It's the most unfinishable of all arts. And that's why I think architecture sort of has an element of ghostliness, that we can go to ancient buildings or old buildings or even unrecognized buildings and see that our spirit brings them alive in some incredible sense. They are alive, even in a form that is not completed because they were ruined, 2,000 years ago. So yeah, architecture has that sense of an unfinishable and yet spiritually most precise art form, because it's completely rigid, you cannot do anything with it. I saw that Barbara took one of her paintings and she cut it.
Right.
Which is fantastic. You cannot do it as an architect, it's hard.
Well, here you have a void that you inserted into the curve.
Yeah.
The picturesque, a view, a way to organize a space, and then now, what about the architectural promenade, the sequence of spaces, how you perceive them? How would you say that operates in your work?
That's a great question, because I believe that architecture has to tell a story. Architecture is a storytelling profession. If it doesn't tell a story, it's more like a refrigerator. A piece of air conditioning is a good mechanism. We need it sometimes, but it doesn't have any story. It's just a piece of air conditioning. Architecture has to tell a story. If it doesn't tell a story, it is a piece of air conditioning. It's just a piece of engineering. It stands there as a building. And I've always believed that that sequence, that like Aristotle said, a good story has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But in my work, it's not in that sequence. It's not necessarily from beginning to middle to end. It can have end, beginning, and middle, or something like that. It doesn't have, it collides in a sort of simultaneous time sequence. But I think it's very, very important.
You've mentioned that you would like to see or visit or maybe design in architecture of acoustics. Daniel is a virtuoso, an accordion virtuoso, I believe.
Yeah.
When I enter a space and it has carpeted walls and acoustical ceiling, it has a very distinct sensation. And my question is, designing a space around acoustics, how might one design that, and how might one conceptually represent that? Would a sketch be appropriate, or something else?
Well, it's a good question. Every building is an acoustical phenomenon. Every city has a different sound. If you go to New York, you go to Paris, you go to London, you go to Barcelona, they are different beings. Their sound is different. We hear them as a different city. So I have used acoustics, and Barbara's Weil studio is around that curve is a very special acoustical space, very unique, and has to do with the kind of incomplete wheels that are also in Barbara's work. This kind of the participant is on the other side of it. So I've designed many buildings in a very systematic way acoustically. The Jewish Museum, for example, the void at the center is really a completion of an opera. You know, I took one of my favorite operas of Arnold Schoenberg, if you know him, his incomplete opera, Moses and Aaron, which he wrote in Berlin, which is about, you know, the meaning of life, actually, the meaning of what was happening in Germany in 1933, 1934. He was exiled out of Berlin. He didn't complete the opera. He couldn't, because the opera ends on the second act where Moses calls to God, and there is just a silence. There's nothing. And he didn't complete the opera. But so I thought he couldn't complete the opera. There is no answer to Moses in 1933. There's silence. And I thought I could complete that opera by creating a void that is acoustically with bridges across it, right, connecting the museum, the Jewish Museum, where you can hear the footsteps of the visitors in an echoing void, which is vertical. And to me, if you listen, if somebody sort of has time, listen, you can hear the answer of God in the third completion of the third act of Moses and Aaron. You hear the answer in the footsteps, the echoing footsteps across the void. So I used that acoustics in buildings in San Francisco. I've used it. I've used it in really more or less deliberately, depending, of course, on the program. Right. In a housing project, you have to use, of course, very different, because apartments need acoustical separation. So the material in which you build them is very special. It has to be very dense material, but it's important because, yeah. We are musical beings. You don't have to be a musician to appreciate sound.
A building is so difficult. Architects and contractors, they get a behind-the-scenes look at challenges that happen in the field, and a lot of money is on the line. Just curious if you could grace us with maybe a behind-the-scenes story that was difficult or humorous or entertaining for the audience without getting yourself in trouble.
Okay, well, I want to tell you, I have to be in terms of transparency. I have to tell you that my wife Nina is here. I would never do what I do if she was not my partner. First of all, she's not an architect, but she's much smarter than I am. Much smarter. And she knows more about developers, about the difficulties of construction, the problems of economy in constructing a project than I do. And because we share, I would never really be an architect if she was not my partner, really. I would probably still be drawing. Right. And living in a very quiet, room. Nina. No, it's truly you have to we have to admit your shortcomings, and it's true. I'll give you an anecdote. I'm going to build the Denver Art Museum. It's a major museum in America, and I go to the City Hall one day in the morning, and I'm walking this fantastic gold-domed City Hall of Denver, and it's a ornate door, and I open the door, and I'm shocked. I see 25 men in suits and Nina at a table. Wow. And I quietly close the door. And, I have no idea, but she was discussing contracts. She was discussing complexities of construction. She was discussing all the things I know very little about.
Amazing. I had a question about your sources of inspiration, that they can be very powerful. We all have sources of inspiration, and And I was talking to Nina a little bit beforehand, and just curious, how often maybe new sources of inspiration are entering into your mind?
All the time. You have to be inspired all the time by something. Have you ever read Alice in Wonderland? Lewis Carroll? You know, Lewis Carroll has a brilliant line in that book. He said that before breakfast, you should have 7 amazing new ideas every morning. You know, I've tried to do it, you know, because it's hard to have 7.
7 is a lot.
7 is a lot. Even to have 2 is hard. But Lewis Carroll, you know, Alice says you should have 7 amazing ideas before breakfast. So you try.
Wow.
And you have to be lucky, you know, because you can't produce interesting ideas out of yourself, right? It doesn't come from you. It has to come from reality, from the world. So, yeah, you have to be sort of poised, like a tiger, you know, somewhere in the jungle, to find the right time to pounce on a piece of inspiration.
Right. I'm hearing an echo coming from in there, and it's incredible. The architecture.
I just
acoustics.
heard it, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, it's just happening just now.
Yeah. There was Barbara speaking.
Yeah. To have 7 pieces of inspiration before breakfast, I think I'm going to have to get up earlier. My wife is back there. She can help. You've designed so much, Daniel, small cities, museums, furniture, towers. I imagine your hands are very capable. What type of project would you like to see next knock on your door?
I've never been an architect who had desires for buildings.
Wow.
You know, if you know, I know a lot of architects or a lot of people who desire something. They want something, and I discovered that the less you desire, the luckier you are. You know, if you desire to do something, it never happens to you, but if you don't, it might happen to you. So I used a kind of a Buddhist method of kind of negative desire.
Right. Wow.
I don't, I'm not one to like, I wish I could design this. I wish I could get this project. I'd love to do this. Quite the reverse. And I often think it's best to just be quiet. Be quiet. And then luckily somebody knocks at your door or writes you an email and said, would you like to, build, a city center here or something like that. And I'm lucky that it has happened to me.
Well, I mean, with how prolific you are, I cannot imagine you meditating there waiting, but...
No, look, let's face it, in life you need luck. I used to call it, fate or fortune or the wheel of, possibilities in Ramon Llull. It's not up to you. It's sometimes amazing people have gotten almost no recognition. I'm listening to a composer whose name is Szymon Weinberg. He's Polish, Jewish, lived his life in Russia, actually. He was Polish, Jewish, but he wound up in Moscow under Stalin, and he's completely unknown. Was unknown till very, very recently. But he was a prolific composer, very close friend of Shostakovich. He died some years ago. I don't think he ever heard any of his music performed. But now we have musicians, composers, CD companies, on the internet, on Spotify, you can begin to get his work. And I often think how lucky it is to have opportunity. And sometimes for some people has come after their death. I mean, think of Van Gogh, one of the greatest, luminaries in the planet of art, died as a poor man, a troubled man. So, it's fortune, good luck. It's something we can't buy. And we can buy a good book about good luck.
Right.
But that's about it.
Thank you. I wanted to also to reach out to the audience to see if we had any questions, and maybe there might be some questions in Spanish so we can help out our translator with the job. Please don't be shy.
Yeah.
microphone.
It's just a question.
Speech.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, do you think a great special building always has to be from the scratch, newly done, or could it be put onto or a kind of restyling of a already existing building? Because as what you said, you know, there's so many ugly buildings, fastly built buildings, and do you think that great design could also be put on one of these buildings, like
Oh, yeah.
upcycling, you know?
Oh, yes.
It's like
I
a,
think
like
so-
a Congress Center.
I
for
think it's a
example.
great question. I think it's a very relevant question in terms of sustainability. I think, yes, we can transform even bad buildings into beautiful buildings by using architectural design and by using new technology. Definitely. I've done it in a number of buildings. Most of my buildings have dealt also with old buildings, formerly built in San Francisco in the turn of the 19th century, in Dresden, again, an armory which was built also in the 19th century. In Berlin, a Baroque building, which was built in the 18th century, 17th century. So yes, I think a very important question. We can transform even buildings that had no character, but have enough substance to be reused, repurposed, and create something really fantastic. I think that's really architecture tradition. That's what architecture was. Most of the buildings, many of the famous buildings in Rome were built by cutting down Greek buildings and putting Greek materials into Roman buildings. Now, that might be sad, but the Romans were pretty good architects.
Anyone else, please? It's being passed this way. It's requested this way.
Yeah.
Mallorca. I'm very curious about your previous life. You were a musician, a professional musician, and then, as you mentioned, you became an architect. Did you leave that as a rupture, or somehow it made sense, since both are arts and they have many things in common, music and architecture?
Thank you. Very good question. You know, when I was a musician and professional, I never thought of architecture. You know, I never thought I'm going to be an architect. But somehow life led me to architecture. I have no idea how. It wasn't sort of something from my childhood that I wanted to build buildings. Not at all. I loved music. But I think my musical love for music also led me to architecture, and also other loves. I love to draw. I love geometry, mathematics, science. So those things, those dimensions of interest, somehow I wound up in architecture. By the way, when I went to school to be interviewed, you know, the Cooper Union was a school, very few students accepted, maybe only 20 into architecture class, and they were interviewed. And I came from a high school called the Bronx High School of Science. The Bronx High School of Science, let me just give you what it is, produced more Nobel Prize winners than all of France. You know, so it was kind of an amazing school. It was just a school in which I was falsely put, because I was not really a scientist, but I somehow wound up there. So when I was interviewed for, you know, the School of Architecture, the interviewer said, somebody with your background should not be coming to study architecture. You should go to MIT. You should study physics. That's you know, your grades. That's what you should be doing. But some, by luck or by God, I wound up in architecture. And how happy, you know, a discovery that all my interest, you know, from music to drawing to my love for numbers and geometry and all the other things, somehow architecture is there. So I cannot say that it was something premeditated or something that I really consciously sort of did, but it just happened to me. Kind of an accident.
Amazing. We have a question here in the front.
Thank you very much for the interesting discussion. I have one question with regard to the Jewish Museum in Berlin, maybe also to the 9/11 memorial, the master planning of it. How hard is it to deal with the history lying on your shoulders when designing it? I mean, how can you, I don't know, design the evil or the horror and, yeah.
Very interesting question, not easy to answer. But it is difficult. There's no doubt about it. It's a huge responsibility. You know, when you are the master planner of Ground Zero, and you have to deliver something, you know, something so important to a site that is really the center of Lower Manhattan, now of Manhattan. There is a lot of responsibility, and against you are all the pressures. You know, there are many different voices. There are many different agendas. You know, there are politicians and developers and engineers and the public. But at the end, you have to ground yourself. And I grounded myself in those whose families perished, those people who died. That's where I started. I didn't start with buildings. I started with what does it feel to be a brother, to lose a brother, a son, a mother, a child, an uncle, a grandparent, in that attack. That's where I started. That was my beginning. That's where all I started with. I didn't start with anything else. The Jewish Museum was very similar. I didn't start with planning a building, thinking of what it should look like, how it should be spatially organized, where should the light come, where should the door be. I started by thinking, who is not there? Why are they not there? Where are they now? Across that Star of David that was erased in a genocide. So it's not so much the responsibility, but where you start. Where do you begin? Where is your foundation? And of course, later on, it's a very complicated process. It's always difficult. It's never easy in a project of that sort, and it never should be easy. You know, as one of my favorite philosophers, Spinoza, the famous Spinoza, who said, the good is difficult, the bad is easy. I never forgot that little line. The bad is easy, the good is difficult. And I always thought, what does he mean by that? That the good is difficult. But I genuinely think it is difficult. To do something good, it's not ever going to be easy, under any circumstance. Now, of course, if you're lucky to meet Barbara Weil and work in a beautiful place like, you know, Mallorca, Port Andratx, and have an intimate relation, that's, you know, the miracle. But most projects are not like that. Most projects have huge challenges. And what can I say? You have to be faithful. You have to be I said you have to be a believer, because without it, you would never do it. You know, you would give up early on. You would say, it's not for me. Let somebody else do it. So it's kind of it's an act of true faith to get involved with projects of that kind. And it's, you know, I'm just going to be opening a project in Amsterdam in September, which is a monument of names. It's a monument to the Holocaust, to the more than 100,000 Jews, Dutch Jews who perished during those evil times. It has more than 102,000 names of Jews and also of Roma. And each name is going to be listed on a brick in a major memorial, which is like a book of memory of what Amsterdam really was, what it still is in a kind of strange way, a city founded by so many Jewish people and murdered by the Nazis, but also through the collaboration of the generation of Dutch people. By the way, the per capita murder of Jews in Holland is the highest in Europe, more than in Poland, more than Ukraine, more than in all those places. So
again, it's a huge task. How do you do it? What is it about? It's not just building something. You know, anybody can build something. But your question is interesting. It's a tremendous commitment, and that project took more than a decade. All these projects take a very long time. Ground Zero is now, we are celebrating the 20th anniversary of Ground Zero, and it's not completed. You know, building the cultural center, the performing arts center is under construction. Tower number 6, the last tower on the south side, is going to go into construction as a residential skyscraper. Tower number 2 is not yet built, so it's in process. It's the 20th year anniversary of the Jewish Museum opening, which was supposed to open on 9/11, by the way. That day, it never opened, because after so many years, it was to open, and of course, after the attacks, it did not open on that day. So again, yeah, all these projects take a long time, and they have an afterlife. They always will have, you know, every project has an afterlife. I think even human beings have an afterlife. Don't you think so? I mean, if not in a religious sense, they have an afterlife in the memory of the loved ones.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You inspired me to have a follow-up question. Speaking of delayed gratification, what do you think about La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona? I mean, here we're talking 100 years to be completed. Could you comment on that?
Well, you know, as I mentioned, Gaudi is probably one of the great artists, modern artists, by the way, because he used modern methods to create Sagrada. The sculptures were created in a modern method. I don't know if you know about it, but how he used chickens and you know, living organisms to create those angels. It's kind of phantasmagorical. I have to say, I've seen the reconstruction, the completion of it, by the Australian engineers. And I have to say, there is such a big difference between Gaudi's work and the completion in quotes, of Sagrada Familia. It's very impressive. I cannot say that I don't love it. It's fantastic, it's impressive. But you can see a hand that is not spiritual. And it's strange, because you don't have to be a Catholic theologian to instantly see the difference. How do we know that difference? Somehow we can just see it, we can feel it. We can see that it's not out of the spiritual need, the desperate spiritual desire for God, but a completion through theoretical engineering theories. So I'm very ambivalent whether it should have been left incomplete with just the drawings of Gaudi completing it. And that's kind of my feeling about any completion. You know, incomplete things, it's hard to complete them. I'm very glad that Venus de Milo, you know, the great Greek sculpture with broken arms and a broken leg, has not been completed. They didn't complete the leg, they didn't complete the arms. They could have. And maybe at some point somebody will have the idea, let's complete Venus de Milo. Why should she be amputated with her arms? But I think I love that sculpture just as it is, just in its state of vulnerability and destruction. It communicates its wholeness. So I'm not for completing. You know, I've heard a number of Mozart sonatas completed by music theorists and experts, but they are definitely not Mozart. They sound nice. They finished the sonata form, but it's definitely not Mozart. I can recognize it instantly. So that much for completion. You cannot complete the incomplete.
Here. I'm curious about here behind. At the
Oh yeah.
Yeah. For example, about the Philharmonic in Bremen, in Germany. When you are designing some place for playing music, do you feel it more as an artistic work, or engineering work? I mean, do you take help of sound engineers for acoustics, like reflections or whatever? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I designed, a performing arts center. It's not just a classical concert hall. It's a really multi-purpose hall in Dublin, right on the waterfront. And because for many years I stood on a stage as a musician, I understood that the acoustics are very important. They cannot be just acoustics for the audience. They have to be also acoustic for the musicians. You know that in many philharmonic halls, they had to go back because the musicians said, we can't hear the music the way we like to hear it. It doesn't sound right to us. It sounds okay for the audience, but not for us. So yes, you have to, of course, employ great musical, acoustical engineers.
Yeah.
It's a state-of-the-art. Definitely now, the engineering of acoustics is very, very formalized as a fantastic field. But you have to have a sense of, this is a hall of 2,500 people in Dublin. And when it opened, one could stand on the stage without a microphone and speak to the whole audience. So yes, you have to be interested in acoustics. And I think it's very important that acoustics really works. Most old concert halls, which had certain proportions, worked very well. Many of the modern concert halls are very difficult, and acousticians have to redo them somehow retroactively, to retroactively put new materials and so on. But one hall that I truly admire is Sharon's Hall in Berlin, because it's a very modern hall with fantastic acoustics, and he was a genius because he somehow, without really the engineering of acoustics yet in flower, created a beautiful acoustical space.
Which one, sorry, in Berlin?
In Berlin.
Ah.
The Philharmonie.
The Philharmonic of Berlin, yeah.
Although they had to readjust a little bit today, and they have some microphones also a little bit to adjust the sound, but still it's a fantastic hall.
Yeah.
Another question? Anyone else?
I would like to ask a question.
We should end, right? The last question.
Last question, thank you.
I'm sorry.
Yes, no,
I
perfect.
hope it's not
Perfect.
too mundane.
It's gonna be
But
great.
the question goes exactly on this aspect. When I think of your work, I see the grandiosity, I see the passion, I see the spirituality, I see everything that you put into it. And one question that keeps begging me every time I see these grand works and the way you talk about it, how do you implement the mundane side of life into those projects, into those buildings? How do you deal with the simplicity of the human beings and the needs of those human beings?
Okay, good
Please.
question. I just won a competition for 2 buildings which are social housing, in New York. Low cost social housing, affordable housing. And that's really, ultimately, about the human being. What do you do with a low budget to create high-density project in the middle of New York, in the middle of the the sites which have these brutal housing blocks? How do you give joy to people, individuality? How do you customize with very little money? How do you make something which is not just another box to imprison old people, but give them a sense of life? Okay, that's what I'm working on. To answer your question, there is no such thing as the mundane side of life. There is no such thing as the mundane side of life. It doesn't exist. Maybe when you go, to the toilet, it's the mundane side of life, but I would not want to make this the center of my work. So there is no mundane side. Every aspect of life is not banal. There is nothing, even in what appears to be the most banal thing. You just want to, go in to the door and sit on a chair and just, have a cup of coffee or something. There's nothing banal in it. And you should never treat it as the banal side of life, as if the museums were the important side of life or public buildings were important, and the other side of life, which is the poor side of life, the low-cost side of life, for the poor people, is not important. So that's not my idea. My idea is that they merge together Of course, it's a very different program to design public housing. But I'm a great believer in it, and you haven't seen it yet, but one of the projects for the elderly is getting to be finished, and it's very interesting. I think it's very interesting because I try to customize every small unit. They're very small units to be interesting. And I always said, you know, I'm not that young. I'd like to live in those projects in Bedford-Stuyvesant. You know, I'd like to live there as an old person because it's got a nice, you know, new ideas in it. You know, social spaces, the windows, it's the small kitchen, you know, the character of the place. So, yeah. I've never thought that we should make this divide. I think this is what made so much bad architecture. Yeah. That this is the banal side of life. Let's leave it to the stupid people. And this is the good side of life. Let's leave it to the successful people. Yeah. And that is bad also for architects. Architects do just luxury projects. And the people who never succeeded do the low-cost housing projects. So I hope that this becomes more of a trend, that there are so many great architects who do social housing projects for low cost.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. You're great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Buenas noches. Thanks very much. Bye-bye. And please come back and enjoy our art exhibitions, Los 12 Artistas, and we have a photography exhibition next month. Bye-bye.